They opened a door the ocean had kept closed for 113 years and found a room dressed for an audience that never left. Rows of burgundy velvet chairs sat like sleeping courtiers, their plush backs bowed by time, and upon many of them lay garments frozen mid-abandonment, a trailing evening coat, a gentleman's lapel with a crushed corsage, a woman's opera cloak folded as if she had risen to applaud. In the hush of the deep, beneath the slow fall of silt and the soft scratch of barnacles, the wreck of the Titanic offered up a secret, a grand cinema, crafted for the aristocratic few, where luxury and ritual met the new miracle of moving pictures, and where, when the ship went down, that hour of private spectacle became an eternal submerged tableau. They called it discovery because the word contains hope, the hope that something lost can be seen again, and the naive promise that seeing will explain. The find began as many deep-sea revelations do, with instruments and patience. A remotely operated vehicle mapped a shadowed niche in the first-class quadrant, a pocket of architecture folded into the ship's ribs. At first, it was only geometry. Symmetrical rows, a curved balcony, a plane of what might once have been a screen. But as lights moved and cameras resolved detail from within the wreck's breastbone, velvet textures and polished brass glints emerged. The space was unmistakable. A cinema large enough to hold an audience habituated to private luxury, its seats upholstered in a deep burgundy that had once swallowed the warmth of hundreds of shoulders. The theater's scale surprised the team. This was no cozy salon tucked in a corner. It was deliberate, a space designed to host gatherings of distinction. The rows were tiered, sightlines calculated, a small gallery ringed above for whispers and observation. At center stage, where a projector once stood, the skeleton of a lantern house lay corroded but eloquent in shape. Ornamental plasterwork, now latticed with sea growth, traced arabesques that testified to an aesthetic of discreet wealth. There is opulence here, but tempered, as if money had learned to be modest about its displays. Evidence suggested the cinema was intended, above all, for an elite clientele. Access points were narrow and guarded by passages that cut from private suites rather than public promenades, implying invitation rather than advertisement. A steward's ledger recovered from a nearby cabin made oblique reference to arrangements for private viewings, and a list of names crossed lightly in ink. Names that in the Times Society directories read like a who's who of commerce and inheritance. Industrialists, titled foreigners, patrons of the arts. To step into that room is to step into the ritual of privilege, an evening's program crafted like a social contract, where seating signified more than comfort, it signified belonging. What arrested the divers' attention most of all, and what made the find feel less like archaeology and more like a ghost story, were the garments. They lay across cushions as if draped by invisible hands. A woman's opera cloak, trimmed with fur now matted with salt, spilled languidly over an aisle seat. A gentleman's evening tailcoat folded across two chairs, one cuff peeking from beneath with a cufflink still faintly intact. In a cluster of seats near the center, a child's knitted cap and a small embroidered handkerchief lay together, suggestive of family presence in the intimate darkness. The clothing told a story of immediacy. These were not carefully packed, trunks or stowed luggage. They were things removed in a hurry, items left behind when a moment demanded movement. Clothing on a seat is intimate evidence. It implies an owner who stood, who turned, who trusted that the chair would hold its place and who planned to return. It argues for an ordinary human posture, impatience, the need to stretch, the casual removal of gloves to run a hand through hair, and then the shocking refusal of that plan by catastrophe. Conservators later would note that fabric fibers, when examined, retained impressions. A faint outline of a palm here, a crease where a brooch had been fastened there. Salt crystals, like tiny fossils, had preserved texture at the microscopic level. In those impressions, specialists read traces of gesture. The clothes, once purely signifiers of status, became fingerprints of presence. The physical theater itself was an archive of service and secrecy. Side passages and discreet doors near private suites allowed guests to slip in without traversing public avenues. A small service hatch at the rear suggested that refreshments were delivered by stewards who knew when to make themselves absent. The lighting fixtures, now dulled and encrusted, bore evidence of careful design. The lamps were positioned not to glare but to gild, to create pools of intimacy rather than a harsh illumination. Acoustic panels, soft fabric-laden walls, now petrified by salt and time, indicated that sound had been part of the experience, probably sustained by a quartet hidden in the wings. Film in that age was silent to the ear, but not to the emotions. Music, live and discreet, would have translated flickering picture into a communal feeling. The reels. Oh, the reels. They were every conservator's nightmare and every historian's hope. Beneath a collapsed row, divers found fragments of nitrate film wound onto rusted cores. Saltwater and cellulose chemistry do not cooperate kindly. What remained were tiny frames, what looked at first like black dust but was in fact the faint language of images. In specialized labs, technologists began the painstaking work of desalination and micro-rescue. Using microscopic imaging and chemical stabilizers, they coaxed shadow out of ruin. An intertitle here with a typographic flourish, a smear of movement there that suggested a carriage or a wave. The frames that emerged were not a contiguous reel, but a collage, a filmic palimpsest that required reconstruction by inference and artistry. What choices had the elite made about what to watch? Early cinema's catalogue was wide. Travelogues bringing exotic cities to the armchair, staged dramas adapted from stage melodramas, quick comedies offering the relief of laughter between courses, and newsy moving images that pinch the world. Outside into the hush of a private room. For this audience, programming would not have been accidental. One imagines a sequence, a travel short of Venice, a comic vignette, a dramatic tableau from a London stage, a news brief about a treaty, or a royal procession. These selections did more than entertain, they curated identity. To screen images of the wider world in a private theatre was to assert cultural currency, to show that one possessed both the capital and the cultivated attention to enjoy the modern spectacle. Yet the wreck made clear more eloquently than any program the suddenness of interruption. Many garments were left as if their owners had risen mid-moment. A woman's opera shoe tucked awkwardly under a chair, a theatre program folded and abandoned on a knee, a glove pinched between two fingers preserved around a crystal stem. These gestures are narrative signposts. They tell of a life moment, an ordinary social breath cut short. This is what makes the find so achingly human. It is not just the glitter of aristocratic taste, but the visual of ordinary habit interrupted. And alongside the robes and coats lay the small domestic things typically invisible in grand narratives. A half-finished hand-painted ticket stub, a silver matchbox embossed with an estate crest, a child's toy horse with a broken wheel. One conservator working in the lab wrote in her notes that the presence of a child's knitted cap among aristocratic evening wear radically altered their understanding of the space. This was not a salon reserved strictly for the titled. Families had gathered here, fragments of generational life sitting side by side. The grandfather in his embroidered vest, the wife with the sable-trimmed wrap, the child with a cap mismatched to the occasion. The theatre had been a microcosm of society, not merely a spectacle of wealth, but a place where the rituals of family, leisure, and status interwove. Ethics shadowed every step. The Titanic is a grave site. To disturb is to converse with the dead. The teams confronted anguished questions. What should be brought to light, and what ought to remain where waves had placed them? They adopted a principle often repeated in maritime archaeology. Retrieve only what must be stabilized and preserved for scientific and memorial reasons. Items chosen for retrieval were those in immediate danger of loss, or those that could meaningfully inform scholarship and memory. Each object lifted to the light was photographed, catalogued, and handled with solemnity. Laboratories designed bespoke desalination baths and humidity chambers to cradle fabric that had not tasted air in over a century. When an opera cloak came to the surface, its removal was treated less like treasure recovery than like a medical procedure. Through conservation, garments revealed more than fabric. Threads of dye told of trade networks, particular mordants found only in imported cloth, a seam style traceable to a specific tailor in London. A hand-stitched hem contained a tailor's tiny signature knot, matching a ledger entry in a preserved Atelier account. A brooch's clasp bore a maker's mark traced to a French atelier. A silver cufflinks monogram corresponded to a family name later cross-checked with passenger lists and estate records. In museums, these convergences of textile science and archival research reconstituted fuller biographies. Suddenly, a tailcoat became not just a symbol of an era, but a marker that could point to a man's papers, his businesses, and letters that recorded private affairs of the heart. And yet artifacts resist simple narratives. The theatre revealed contradictions. Its very sumptuousness, the velvet, the brass, the attentive service, was built upon social distances that the Titanic's layout made literal. While the wealthy watched in private comfort below decks, servants and third-class passengers endured cramped conditions and limited access to lifeboats. The cinema, in its exclusivity, becomes a lens for a larger moral reflection. Entertainment can both reveal and conceal, celebrate and distract. Some scholars argued that the space represented the gilded insulation of privilege, a place where the spectacle of a modern world was consumed without responsibility for the conditions that produced it. Others countered that the theatre was also a human space where shared stories offered consolation, where laughter and tears were common to all social ranks, and that those gestures, when seen in the wreck, awaken empathy rather than condemnation. The fragments of film produced their own small miracles. A single restored intertitle read like a time capsule, an advertisement for pictures to please the most refined, and a note of the evening's program. Another frame showed a woman lifting her hand in a gesture almost identical to her frozen counterpart in the garments found on the floor. The uncanny alignment of image and cloth created a cinematic palimpsest. Real objects and projected images commingled, making it possible, for a moment, to imagine who sat where, what they laughed at, which stories moved them. Archives prepared real reconstructions, using interpolation and historical context to create sequences that could be projected for modern audiences as an act of historical empathy. In the quiet debates among curators and historians, one theme persisted. This cinema was less an artifact of excess than a mirror. It reflected the human scale of ritual and routine within the structures of power. The burgundy seats are sumptuous, yes, but they also absorb the sound of whispers and the weight of small sorrows.